Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, CEO of Trends Research and Advisory, allow me to welcome you all to today's conversation with our distinguished guest, Dr. Michael Knights. Dr. Michael Knights is the Jill and J. Bernstein Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he specializes in the military and security affairs in Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf states. He earned his undergraduate and PhD degrees from the Department of War Studies in King's College, London. Dr. Knights is also a leading expert in Yemen and a respected analyst on Middle Eastern affairs. It is an honor to have him with us today to shed light on his latest book, titled 25 Days to ADEN, The Unknown Story of the Arabian Elite Forces at War, which provides a detailed account of the events that led to the fall of ADEN to the Southern Transitional Council, a separatist group in Yemen's south. The book draws on Dr. Knight's extensive research, as well as his first-hand experience of the conflict in Yemen. It is a gripping account of a critical moment in the Yemeni civil war and sheds light. We will also seek Dr. Knight's knowledge and expertise in the field to expand our understanding of the Yemeni conflict, its future, and chances of achieving peace there. Dr. Knights, welcome.
Thank you.
Let me begin by asking you, before you dive into the very interesting details of your book, in which you provide a very unique perspective on the Yemeni conflict, what inspired you to write the book, especially taking the risk to go to a battlefield, and what do you hope readers will take away from it?
Well, thank you very much for having me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here at Trends in Washington, D.C. We know of your research and we love collaborating with you. So I hope to see you in Washington and back here again in Abu Dhabi. For me, writing this book brought a lot of parts of my life together. I've spent a lot of time on battlefields around the Middle East over the last 20 years. In Iraq every year for the last 20 years. In Yemen from 2006 to 2010 and from 2015 onwards, and other areas across the region. I love Yemen as one of my key focus areas. It's one of my favourite places to travel to in the world. Really interesting country. And I love the UAE military, where I've studied the UAE military right back to the early 2000s. And I always knew that the UAE military would become one of the most advanced militaries in the region, because I could see how they were operating in places like Somalia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, and other areas. So this book brought those things together. My love of Yemen and my love of watching the UAE military grow. And so when the Yemen war started in 2015, I began to embed with UAE armed forces in Yemen to take a look at how they were operating on the ground. You can't really understand a war unless you actually go and spend time with the armed forces involved in the war. Only by living with them, watching them undertake their operations, sitting at night with them while they eat their food, talk about their families, but then going out during the day with them on operations. Only then can you really understand what it's really like inside a war and how the military forces are prosecuting that war. The Yemen war and the Gulf Coalition involvement in the Yemen war is not very well understood in the West. There is a strong negative lean in the coverage of the Yemen war. And in some ways, the war is complicated, messy, and unpleasant, like all wars. There are collateral damage incidents, there is humanitarian consequences of any kind of conflict. But there's a lot of other things happening inside the Yemen war as well. And one of them is a very strong performance by the UAE military, a very strong capability by the UAE military to work with local Yemeni forces, to build the armed forces, and to provide humanitarian support and governance support inside Yemen. And I wanted to show how a non-Western military undertakes the same kind of missions that we've seen the US and the British and others undertaking in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever. So I wanted to show what happens when you mix together a force that has Western military training and experience and technology, but the force is also 100% Arabic speaking, 100% culturally attuned to the local people. When you bring those two things together, it's a very powerful combination. You know, when I was with the forces in Iraq, for instance, for many years, it was great that the US and UK forces were so professional, but hardly anybody spoke Arabic. Hardly anybody understood the culture, and this was a real problem. So I wanted to see what it was like when you brought both things together. Excellent training and equipment, but also an understanding of the local culture. And that's what we had in the Yemen war. So that's what inspired me to write this book, was to provide an inside look at how a regional military undertakes complex operations.
That's truly great, Dr. Knight. I can give you, the floor right now to maybe delve into more detail about the story of the book, what you've seen there in the war zone in Yemen. If you can just share that with the audience, please.
Well, there's a lot to say here, and I almost don't know where to start. But I'll start by saying this. I mean, in addition to the book being out in English now, because that's the language it was written in. Unfortunately, my Arabic's not good enough to write a book, for sure. The book will be out in Arabic within the next month or two. And it will be a very close translation of the original version. And all the maps will be translated into Arabic as well. So for the first time, there will be a really detailed military history of the UAE military in battle. And it will be there in Arabic for everyone here, translated by the Abu Dhabi Language Centre. So I'm very excited about that, and I'd love to come back when more people have had a chance to take a look at the book and when more Emiratis have, had a chance to read it. But I'll begin by saying this. 25 Days to ADEN is the start of what I think of as a trilogy of books about the UAE military in ADEN. This is the beginning. The first battle of the Yemen war in 2015, where the UAE plays a key role in saving ADEN from the Houthi advance. Now, back then in March of 2015, the Houthis had already taken over Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. And at that point, the Iranians were boasting that they controlled 4 Arab capitals, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut and Sana'a. But the Yemeni government, supported by the UN, was still in existence, and it moved its headquarters to ADEN, the largest port in Yemen and the second largest city in Yemen. And so the Houthis, alongside with the ousted president of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, decided to try and overrun ADEN and knock the UN-backed government out of the country. At that moment, the Houthis became very close to winning the war in Yemen. And that would have been a very negative outcome. The Houthis, ever since the 1980s, have been trying to copy the model of Lebanese Hezbollah. And this would have created a southern Hezbollah that controlled the entire country, including the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, including all of Yemen's ports, including all of its land borders with Saudi Arabia and Oman. This couldn't happen. And the Emiratis made the very brave decision to get in there and support the Yemeni resistance in ADEN on the ground. Now, this is a moment when the Emiratis are already supporting NATO in Afghanistan. They're already helping with the war against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, in Yemen. And they take on another mission at the same time, which is to support the ADEN resistance fighters to hold their city against the Houthis. And for a while, it's really, really close. It's a very exciting story. It's one of the things that brought me to this story, is that it's history, but it's also truly an adventure. The resistance fighters in ADEN have almost less than one gun per person, no heavy weapons, almost no tanks, and the Houthis are bringing tons of tanks and armoured vehicles down to the south. It's almost impossible to imagine the people of ADEN can hang on. Their back is to the sea, and they only control small parts of the city. But when the Emirati forces come in, they bring with them airstrike controllers, people who can bring the Saudi and Emirati airstrikes down on the Houthis. And just 8 men and a radio manage to turn the tide of the battle, and they hold the city. And then the rest of the story is about how the UAE decides to reinforce the defensive pocket in ADEN until it can eventually break out and smash the Houthi forces out of ADEN and pursue them for 100 kilometers in every direction. This is what saves southern Yemen from the Houthis.
That is truly incredible. I have a question about the international community and how they played a role in the conflict. How do you think their involvement impacted the outcome of this conflict?
Well, the international community did and still does recognise the Yemeni government as the legitimate UN-backed government of the country. Mm-hmm. The international community just yesterday renewed the sanctions against the Houthi leadership inside Yemen. So on the one hand, the international community has taken a position which is that the Houthi takeover of Sana'a in late 2014 and its war to take over the rest of the country in 2015 was a war of aggression, and that it was not legitimate. So, you know, the United Nations is not neutral in this conflict. It recognises that the Houthi invasion of the country was wrong. On the other hand, the international community has, in my view, reacted to the Yemen war slightly strangely. You know, back in the 1950s, when North Korea and the Chinese invaded South Korea, or rather tried to overrun the whole of Korea, the United Nations acted very swiftly to deploy military forces to Korea. They stopped the invading North halfway in the country, and they allowed the South Korea to survive, and today it's a powerful state that is in better condition than the north of Korea. If you ask anyone about the Korean War, if you said, do you think the United Nations were wrong to intervene in Korea? People would say, of course not. They had to stop the whole country from being overrun by the communists in the north. But with Yemen, they have a bit of a different view. It's less clear to them that the Gulf Coalition was doing the right thing. But, you know, of course, the Yemeni government requested military assistance from the United Nations and from the Arab League. And that's exactly what the Gulf states did. And with going back to the Korean War again, if you were to ask most people, did the United Nations lose the Korean War? They would say, of course not. They held the line and they saved South Korea. And that's kind of how I view the Gulf Coalition mission in Yemen. Like the Korean War, it was a very messy war with a lot of death and killing and famine, but it was also necessary to stop the whole country from being overrun by the Houthis, who are backed by Iran.
Very interesting. So do you think that maybe the US could have played a bigger role in saving Aden in this Yemeni conflict? I'm just curious to know your opinion.
Well, I'm a bit of a hawk by Washington standards, so I do want the US to be involved in military interventions in this way. I think the US can be a force for good. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons I wrote this book was because when the US would not become involved, the UAE decided to be the force for good. And I really applaud that. A lot of people find the Yemen war very unpleasant, too complicated for them. They don't want to deal with the realities of the Yemen war. But for me, somebody had to do something in 2015, and I'm glad that the Emiratis and the Gulf Coalition intervened in the way it did. We didn't let Kuwait be wiped out of existence by Saddam. There's no reason why we would let Yemen be wiped out of existence by the Houthis. So yes, the US could have done more, but what I find fascinating, why I wrote 25 Days to ADEN, is that this is an example of the Gulf states doing something by themselves and doing it very well. The US and other Western partners train the UAE military and they arm the UAE military. And they say, we want you to be more independent and take more responsibility for your own security. Well, this is what it looks like. If the US doesn't want to do something, it has to accept that other people will look after their own security and they'll act the way they need to act to ensure that security. So, in the US, they went into the Yemen war in 2015 thinking if the US doesn't intervene, well, no one can intervene. But that's not true. The Gulf Coalition, in just a week, pulled together the largest military coalition of Arab states ever really seen. And they undertook this operation almost 100% on their own. And for a lot of Americans and other international observers, this was shocking, that they could pull together the same kind of air campaign that the US would prosecute against, let's say, Serbia in the 1990s. So it shows you, I think it's a very modern story because it's talking about how players act when the US does nothing. They take matters into their own hands, and in many cases, they're quite good at it.
Amazing, thank you. Do you also think that maybe there is different aspects that played a role in making this 25 days battle a success?
So, one of the things that I dwell on in the book a lot is the way the UAE military is very good at working with local partner forces within the Islamic world. And that's particularly true in southern Yemen. Many of the Emirati Special Forces officers had worked with Yemenis a lot in the past. And some of them even had sort of tribal connections to the eastern Yemen area and the Dhofari area of Oman. So, these communities were not very far apart, even at the beginning. Many Yemenis work here in the UAE, within the construction sector, within business, within the police originally. And so there was some connection there already that they worked on. And the Emirati forces are very humble when it comes to working with the locals. Everybody knows the Emirates is a rich country. Everybody knows that other Arab nations admire the Emirates. That makes the Emirati security forces very secure in themselves. They don't need to show off. They just interact with the locals in a very humble way, living with them, eating the same food as them, observing the same customs as them. So they're very successful at building partner forces. When the US or Britain tries to build an armed force in the military, like the Iraqi military, let's say, they make it much too complex. They try to make a copy of British military or American military, and to try and do that is almost impossible in this post-conflict setting. What's great about the UAE armed forces is that they work out how good does the partner force need to be. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough to beat the enemy. Keep it simple. Work with the local culture. Work with the local leadership structures. Don't try and change everything. And because the UAE has quite a pragmatic way of thinking and a lot of experience in the Middle East, they can really build local forces quickly, cheaply, and good enough to get the job done. So that's one of the factors of success in ADEN, is the very close relationship between the Emiratis and the local ADEN people.
Mm-hmm. So
and
you
the
would say
leadership.
like similarities in culture and the Arabic language and all of that, right?
Yeah, and also that Emiratis are just very good at working with people.
Mm-hmm.
They have an openness about other cultures, about other parts of the Arab world. They're not trying to be the master, they're trying to be the partner.
Definitely. So is there any specific lessons that can be learned from the conflict in Yemen, and how might they be applied to future conflicts in the region?
Well, the key lesson that can be applied to any conflict, and it's particularly true in the Yemen environment, is that it is much easier to stop a war before it begins than to stop a war after it's begun. This means that prevention and deterrence and early warning are the most critical things we can develop. If the Houthis could have been stopped from taking over Sana'a in September of 2014, we would not be in this situation now, where we have essentially a southern Hezbollah, much larger than Lebanese Hezbollah, educating millions of young Yemenis in intolerance, in hatred of the West, hatred of Israel, hatred of Saudi Arabia. This is a disaster. The best option would have been if it could have been stopped before it began. That means a settlement in Yemen in the 2011 through to 2014 period. Imagine how much loss and bloodshed and misery could have been avoided if in that time period we had all succeeded in creating some kind of power sharing situation in Yemen, some system. Then, when we move into the war era, 2014 to 2015, imagine if the international community and the Gulf Coalition could have held Sana'a instead of losing the capital of the country to the Houthis. This would have been a much better situation. So for me, the first lesson is that prevention is always better than the cure. Mm-hmm. We need to act early. We need to identify truly destabilizing moments before they come. And we need to identify them a good year before they happen, because we know it takes that amount of time to create a real policy response. So that's why the work of places like Trends or the Washington Institute for Near East Policy are so important. We have to look over the hill and see these things coming, and we need to do that more effectively all the time. In terms of the military lessons of the conflict, I think one of the key lessons is that Gulf military forces can undertake complex operations on their own without US or Western support. Now, you don't want to do that all the time. You can see how overuse of US military force since 2001 has stretched the US military to breaking point and stretched the US economy and made it easier for a rival like China to begin building up its power. So nobody wants to overuse their military forces, but it's important that Arab forces maintain the readiness to intervene when they need to. The intervention in Yemen in 2015 saved the country from being completely lost to the Houthis and to Lebanese Hezbollah and Iran. This is a significant accomplishment. It may not feel like that now because the war is very unpopular and it's caused a lot of geopolitical costs to the Gulf Coalition partners. But I think over time history will view the Yemen war as a necessary war and a partially successful one as well.
So based on your experience with the ongoing conflict in Yemen, what are, in your opinion, the chances of achieving peace there? What are the most likely scenarios to achieve peace in Yemen?
Well, so I've spent quite a bit of time in Yemen before this war and during this war. it's probable that Yemen will never be a strongly centralised country, because it hasn't been for most of its existence. And there's significant regional differences within the country. And that's one of the things that makes Yemen so interesting and fun to travel to, is how different the different parts of the country are. Unlike some other countries in the region, it doesn't have a strong federal government. It doesn't have a history of that, really. So we can expect it to be decentralised going forward. We should also have expectations that there will never be 100% truce in Yemen. Yemen is a place where there will be rival armed factions in the future. But what we want is for there to be a ceasefire most of the time, in most of the places. My expectation for conflict termination in Yemen is that it is coming. We can already see right now that both sides recognise they probably cannot defeat the other, the Houthi forces and the anti-Houthi forces. The international community is quite focused on Yemen. It is providing significant assistance to the ceasefire and peace efforts in the country. And what I find very encouraging is that the Houthis are starting to focus on economics. So they're saying, we want a share of the revenues from the oil and gas produced in Yemen. And we want that share to go into paying salaries inside the Houthi areas. That is the beginning of a negotiation process. In a sense, they're already beginning to negotiate. We will allow you to export oil and gas if you share with paying some of the costs of the government in the Houthi-held areas. Now, this is not a good outcome. Geostrategically, it's going to result in there being effectively a Houthi state in the same way we have North Korea. And in many ways, it's going to be like North Korea. Dangerous, missile and drone threat right at the heart of a critical region with a dictatorial government that we cannot remove. That's the reality. But it's probably better than an ongoing war in Yemen. So I do think we will see conflict termination. You can see at the moment, even though there's no formal ceasefire, both sides are holding back. And there's good incentives for them to continue holding back.
That is good news, I guess. So what is the key message that you would like the readers to get away from your book?
Well, the first message is I want the readers to enjoy a military history about their own country. They'll be used to reading military histories about all sorts of other countries and other wars, but this is about the Emiratis and the Yemenis. So I hope, particularly when it's released in Arabic, that it will be something young Emiratis can read to understand what their country did in Yemen, why they did it, and why in many ways it's very admirable, and to be proud of how their armed services performed in Yemen. I like to think that some of the families of the martyred Emiratis will read it as well. This book is dedicated to the 5 Emiratis who died in the Battle of ADEN. And I hope it brings them some comfort to see that the sacrifices they made did result in a victory. Right now, ADEN in the south of Yemen is still a very messy place, but it really is recovering as a city. Economically, it's coming alive again. The city actually looks really beautiful right now. It's recovering from the battle damage, and it's a wonderful place. And it's only free because the Emirati forces were able to intervene there. So, the primary message is learn about your military history, be proud, and one day start to, write your own military histories. Somebody like me shouldn't be writing military history of the Emiratis, but, today, I come from a military history background. I'm a military historian by training. I wanted to lend some of that training to the UAE, to apply my military history background to your military history. In the future, I look forward to reading many histories written by Emiratis about your own armed forces.
Thank you. For policymakers and war strategists, what would be one advice, to get from you and your book?
Well, probably the key piece of advice is this. If you're going to ask US partners to develop their own armed forces and capabilities, you must back them up when they then use those armed forces. You cannot say to people, look after your own security, and then criticize them when they act. You've either got to drive the car, or you've got to be in the back seat of the car. But you cannot drive the car from the back seat. You've got to let people do what they have to do. And if you're telling them to drive, let them drive.
Thank you, Dr. Knights. If anyone from the audience have questions, okay, Mr. Awad.
Thanks, Dr. Michael, for this great talk about your book. I totally agree with you about US when they try not to support their partner, and also telling them not to intervene or do or protect their own security. You mentioned in your talk you're gonna have a trilogy of this book, or a series, I think, right? Can you talk more about it, please?
Yes, certainly. So I really enjoyed writing 25 Days to ADEN. It was, for me, a very easy book to write because the material was so strong, and I had gathered so much of it when embedded with UAE armed forces in Yemen. During the course of that, I produced a lot of other research on the fight against Al-Qaeda in Mukalla and eastern Yemen, and also the final campaign of the war in Hodeidah, which is a very interesting case study on the Red Sea coast of the UAE forces and the Yemenis really having a war-winning opportunity, but being stopped from completing that battle by international pressure. So it's a very 21st century story of how you can win on the battlefield, but if you don't win off the battlefield, you get nothing. You have to win also in international media, in diplomacy. So, these are the three stories I want to tell. The second one being Mukalla and the fight against Al-Qaeda, and the third one being the Hodeidah Red Sea Coast Offensive. And I've gathered a lot of the source material for them, but now it's time to rock into the second book. One of the things I want to say about the UAE's fight against Al-Qaeda in Yemen is that from the very beginning, the UAE's primary enemy in Yemen was Al-Qaeda. The UAE was already operating in Yemen against Al-Qaeda when the Houthis took over Sana'a in 2014 and then tried to attack Aden in 2015. So for the Emiratis, job number one was always Al-Qaeda and preventing them from exploiting the vacuum in Yemen during the new war. And what's amazing to me is that alongside all the things the Emirates had to do in Aden, Bab el-Mandeb, Red Sea Coast, Taz, Jazan, Marib, all the places where they fought, they said, you know what, we'll do that, but we'll also do the fight against Al-Qaeda. They didn't stop their anti-Al-Qaeda fight to cope with the Houthis. They said, we'll do both. And for me, that was a very brave decision. So I want to cover that in the same detail I did with the Battle of Aden in 2015. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Same, thank you. Do we have any more questions? Okay, so a question in the back. No, it's fine.
Good morning, thank you very much. Let me tell you a secret. I didn't read the book yet, but I read some review for the book. And from time to time in the review, you said Arabic coalition. Now you said Gulf coalitions. What's the difference? And what's the more realistic concept and why? I have my point of view, but I need to hear your point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm speaking about the Middle East in English, which means I have to be imprecise. I can't be precise, right? So, Gulf Coalition is the phrase that's most often used to describe. And honestly, it was a Gulf Coalition because Egypt played very minimal part, much less than we expected, actually, especially in the ADEN campaign, considering it's, right off the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb. You would expect the Egyptian military to play a bigger role. But this was very much UAE, Saudi and Gulf forces war. Eventually the Sudanese became heavily involved, but they were really brought in via the Emiratis and the Saudis. So, this was very much a Saudi-Emirati show. And so for me, it's Gulf Coalition, really. The UAE is very modest, so they don't like books to be about the UAE. They like books to be about the Arabs and the Gulf Coalition. But in reality, this story is Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with a couple of interesting contributions by Morocco, Kuwait, Bahrain.
Thank you so much. Do we have any more questions? Okay, I guess not. So, thank you, Dr. Knights. Your book, 25 Days to Aden, is a timely and important contribution to our understanding of the Yemeni conflict. And your analysis of the events that led to the fall of Aden provides valuable insights into the complex dynamics of the conflict and the regional rivalries that fuel it. It is an essential read for anyone seeking to understand the current state of affairs in Yemen and the broader implications for the Middle East. And with that, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we come to the end of this remarkable session with Dr. Michael Knights, and on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, CEO of Trans Research and Advisory, I would like to thank Dr. Knights for joining us today and sharing his insights on his latest book. His expertise on Yemen and the Middle East is invaluable, and we are grateful for this contribution to the field. We hope that this conversation has provided our listeners with a deeper understanding of the Yemeni conflict and the important role that regional dynamics play in shaping it. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you will join us for future conversation on critical issues facing our world today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.